One day, a god decides it's time to bring humanity back into the stars and creates giant superhuman soldiers in a basement on Terra that would be known as Space Marines. The 20 legions of these super soldiers will struggle with their identities, their purpose, their faith, and ultimately each other. And each of these legions is unique in ways you wouldn't believe. So welcome to our breakdown of the 20 legions of the Adeptus Astartes from Warhammer 40k. We might as well start at number 1. The first legion of Astartes is also coincidentally one of the most celebrated, despite their habit of secrecy. Often tasked with some of the most important and high-profile missions, the Dark Angels enjoyed much of the spotlight during the Great Crusade. Their first recorded deployment was the defense of the Imperial Palace during the Palace coup attempt in the Unification Wars. Many of the first legionnaires, who would eventually become the Dark Angels, were used to experiment with fighting styles and organizational techniques that would later be used in the other legions. This led to an air of superiority that hung over the first in every encounter with their fellow legions, earning them the unofficial nickname, the Uncrowned Princes. Many First Legion warriors started taking the names of epic heroes from Terran myth as they slowly began believing their own hype. However, this led them to believe there was nothing they could learn from the rest of the Imperium, or even from their brother Space Marines. And so, by the time their Primarch, Lionel Johnson, was found, the first was a legion of secretive and superior traditionalists ruled by a circle of pseudo-nobility called hosts. Oddly, the prideful leaders of the legion did not at first welcome the presence of their Primarch the way other legions did, and it took quite a few duels for the Lion to beat some sense into this group of Astartes. Unfortunately, this feeling of bitterness and wounded pride became a festering undercurrent of heresy that came to a head when Horus attacked the Imperium. The legionnaires who had still shown resistance to the Lion and his new tactics had been sent to guard their homeworld of Caliban and were deeply upset about the perceived slight against their honor. In a final act of rebellion, these Marines became the fallen, turned against the Imperium, forcing the Lion to destroy most of Caliban and fight his former best friend Luther. Heavily wounded, the Primarch slept for over 10 millennia until waking during the Indomitus Crusade. Currently, the Dark Angels are one of the strongest Space Marine chapters, working in concert with their successor chapters better than any other legion, all while hunting down what remains of their fallen brothers in secret. That's weird. All it says here is Error 404, Legion not found. Well, on to the next one, I guess. A legion diminished by the near-total loss of its gene seed, the Emperor's children were a faint echo of the other legions by the time Fulgrim was found and given command. Driven by his personal need to prove himself as the perfect son of the Emperor and his compulsive need for efficiency, Fulgrim drove his legion to never waste resources or energy, creating some of the most obsessed Marines in the Imperium. For some time after Fulgrim took command, the Third Legion wasn't able to take part in many of the more glorious and notable campaigns of the Great Crusade as they worked to replenish their numbers. Once they were ready, however, they proved overeager and ended up volunteering for challenges that would stress even the better-equipped legions. This exposed them to the taint of chaos early on, and by the time the Heresy was being planned, the Emperor's children and their Primarch had almost been fully taken by the ruinous powers. The Emperor's children and their Primarch were manipulated at almost every step of the way. Horus saw his inexperienced and eager young brother as a useful tool, even leveraging his relationship with Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands in an attempt to pull yet another legion to his side. For his part, Fulgrim is often depicted as mostly naive, but we shouldn't forget that he is a Primarch, a superhuman warrior with a huge, wrinkly brain and tons of ambition. His legion was very much the same, a fact the Prince of Excess exploited with gusto. Masters of siege warfare, these implacable warriors were often more stubborn than the fortresses they garrisoned. Making matters worse, their Primarch Perturabo was a strict disciplinarian, instituting decimation as punishment whenever the legion failed to measure up to his high standards, which thankfully wasn't often. Choosing 1 out of every 10 of your friends to be beaten to death is a strong motivator to not make mistakes. The real problem for the Iron Warriors was that they were too good at what they did. Long, protracted sieges and trench warfare are difficult for any soldier, and though Space Marines are superhuman in many ways, they're built for quick, decisive strikes, not drawn-out warfare. The Iron Warriors took these assignments without complaining so often that they got pigeonholed into the role. Whenever a tough enemy had dug in, the Emperor sent the Iron Warriors to blast them out. Whenever a fortress needed guarding by more than human infantry, he called on the Iron Warriors. This slowly bred resentment and bitterness in the Legion, and especially in its Primarch, who grew envious of the praise and honors heaped on his more noteworthy brothers. When Horus approached him about fighting the Emperor and his upstart Loyalist brothers, Perturabo and his legion didn't hesitate to say yes, although they remain, to this day, one of only 2 traitor legions who staunchly refuse to worship the gods of chaos. The 5th Legion is one of the very few examples of Astartes forces that operated relatively the same before and after the introduction of their Primarch. Originally called the Star Hunters, these Astartes were not often found in the grand battles of the Unification Wars or the Great Crusade, being instead held back as scouts and hunters, tracking down enemies of the Emperor for other legions to destroy. Not that the 5th was incapable of fighting campaigns on their own, their war record during the Great Crusade proves that, but their hit-and-run tactics were better suited for smaller-scale fights. And while effective, the other legions thought very little of their brothers from the 5th. This image didn't change much after their Primarch Jagatai Khan was found. The newly renamed White Scars began to pick up more culture and pride than they had ever enjoyed. While Jagatai inherited a legion already capable of fighting in a style he loved, they were hollow, joyless men in desperate need of something to enrich themselves. Jagatai ordered each Marine to take up a hobby: calligraphy, painting, storytelling, needlepoint, anything to make the Marines of the White Scars feel a little less like mindless killing machines. And it worked. The White Scars kept to their duties of scouting and hunting the enemies of the Imperium without complaint. And when the time came to choose a side in the Heresy, they stuck with the Loyalists and hunted down their traitorous former allies. It's even a tradition that has persisted to this day, with the great hunts of the Khan regularly finding and dispatching some of the deadliest enemies of the throne. The Rout, the Vulca Fenrica, the Space Wolves, the 6th Legion Astartes has had several names across its history, and it's been quite a bloody one. One of the so-called trefoil legions, the 6th was made for a very specific purpose: to kill other Space Marines. The relatively small size of the Legion was due in large part to the volatility of their gene seed, a precaution the Emperor baked in just in case his favorite executioners ever turned on him. Not that it made any difference to their effectiveness. During the Unification Wars and the early Great Crusade, the 6th Legion was only unleashed when the Emperor wanted to make a point or needed a problem dealt with permanently. The warriors of the 6th soon gained a reputation for being some of the most savage fighters in the Imperium, a fact that worked well to keep potential traitors in line. 2 very important things happened to the 6th Legion during the Great Crusade. Their Primarch Leman Russ was found, the Wolf King, renaming his legion the Space Wolves, and at some point, The wolves were called upon to fulfill their intended role as the emperor's executioners, killing the Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th legions and mauling the surviving Marines so badly that none dare speak of the 2 lost legions ever again. It was these acts that led the other Primarchs to rightfully fear Rus and his legion. It was said that out of every Primarch, only the lion could have stood against the wolf in combat, a thought tested in the bitter feuds the 2 Primarchs had over the years. The problem with this reputation, of course, was that the legionnaires of the 6th and their Primarch never really gained a close relationship with their peers. It's hard to trust someone who you know would kill you as easily as drink with you if the emperor commanded it. This was taken to its extreme during the Heresy, when Horus successfully tricked the wolves into attacking the Thousand Sons with false orders, keeping them from helping their allies on Terra during the siege. To this day, the wolves are known as some of the most incredibly deadly warriors in the galaxy, and are not above fighting other Imperials who step out of line. Out of all the Space Marine legions, only the 7th has claimed Terra as its official homeworld. The Imperial Fists established themselves early on as excellent defensive troops, proficient in the building of defenses and the nuances of a more aggressive defense style that lent itself perfectly to Space Marine capabilities. This changed very little once they were reunited with their Primarch Rogel Dorn. Dorn was staunchly loyal and favored uncomplicated, straightforward approaches to every problem. Under his stewardship, the Imperial Fists became as well known for heavy assault tactics as they were for their ability to defend. This led them to be used quite often as the Emperor's blunt instrument, either breaking sieges that had held on too long or defending desperate last stands the Emperor could not afford to lose. In this way, the Imperial Fists gained a rivalry with the Iron Warriors, the latter becoming very bitter that the Fists often received honors for the daring actions they were assigned, while the Iron Warriors were relegated to the longer, less exciting parts of the same sieges. For his part, Dorn seemed completely uninterested in that rivalry, thinking only of his duty to the Imperium. It was Dorn who constructed the imposing defenses of the Imperial Palace on Terra, and it was Dorn who accompanied the Emperor onto Horus's battle barge at the climax of the siege. His inability to stop the deaths of both his brother Sanguinius and the Emperor very nearly broke him, and while he very nearly came to blows with his brother Guilliman in the aftermath, he eventually decided it was best to keep what was left of the Imperium together. Today, the Imperial Fists and their successor chapters fight as roving armies, crusading from one system to the next, never settling down. So while the Fists claim Holy Terra as their homeworld, their real headquarters is their ancient mobile battle station called the Phalanx. The 8th Legion, the Night Lords, are one of the most controversial of the Astartes forces, and that's saying something. The Emperor had his executioners to deal with traitors, his spies, his scouts, all roles useful for galactic-scale warfare. But like any tyrant, the Emperor was worried about the masses rising up in revolt. No matter how many Marines he made or campaigns he fought, the trillions upon trillions of people in the new Imperium would always outnumber his armies and could force him to waste energy putting out revolutions instead of conquering. So the Emperor chose to make himself a terror force. The legionnaires of the 8th specialized in scare tactics, not like the space wolves who were terrifying in open combat, but by cutting your power, creeping through dark shadows, taking over Vox feeds to broadcast the screams of the dying, flaying people, and hanging them in the town square. They fought dirty and ugly. They made the very idea of fighting the Imperium terrifying. It wasn't long before the other Primarchs took a stand. And here is probably the biggest instance of cowardice by the Emperor himself. It's very clear he created the Night Lords to be this way, and ordered them to act like this. Just like with Angron of the World Eaters, the Emperor knew that the Primarch of the VIII, Conrad Kurz, was racked with mental instability that might have been curable, but chose to do nothing and disavow the Night Lords when their acts of terror turned on Imperial citizens. Needless to say, the Night Lords sided with Horus and the Traitors when the time came, though they never accepted worship of the Chaos Gods. Their only goal after the Heresy has seemingly been to tear down the rotting edifice of the Imperium that betrayed them. Originally designed as one of a handful of shock troop armies, the legion that would become the Blood Angels were often deployed either as the very tip of the Emperor's spear or wherever a stubborn enemy needed to be wiped out wholesale. It was a job the 9th Legion excelled at, often replenishing lost Marines with new stock taken from their enemies. In this way, the Legion gained a reputation for returning from dangerous campaigns with the same number of Marines they departed with. But that wasn't the only rumor. All Marines can eat flesh for information or sustenance, but the 9th became known for ritualistically eating their slain foes after battle, indulging in a red thirst for blood. This reputation pushed them further from the rest of the Imperium. They were shunned and slowly began to devolve into feral murderers. And then Sanguinius was found. The angelic Primarch had grown up on the radiation-blasted world of Baal, and when he was given his legion, the incredibly psychic Primarch instantly felt a connection to his gene-sons. Instead of demanding they swear an oath to him, Sanguinius swore an oath to them. They would rise together or fall together. Under his leadership, the Blood Angels went from pariahs to one of the most decorated assault legions in the Imperium. It's no surprise that the Marines of the Blood Angels Legion had the strongest bond with their Primarch, only strengthened by his psychic abilities. When Horus slew Sanguinius aboard his ship at the climax of the Siege of Terra, the entire legion broke, succumbing to an illness that would become known as the Black Rage. As the rage takes hold, afflicted Marines believe they are Sanguinius facing down treacherous Horus and dying. No one knows when it will strike a Blood Angel, but the effects are almost always irreversible, with only rare exceptions. Today, the Blood Angels are one of the strongest chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, but the rage still afflicts them, forcing their leadership to place their raven comrades into doomed squads called the Death Company, so they might seek their end in battle. The 10th Legion had always been as relentless as their Primarch, even before Ferrus Manus was found. Called the Stormwalkers during the Unification Wars, the 10th had a very simple, straightforward approach to warfare, not unlike the warriors of the Death Guard, in fact. By the beginning of the Great Crusade, it was clear the Stormwalkers had an affinity for heavy vehicles and mobile artillery, simply advanced toward the enemy until it wasn't a problem anymore. This hardly changed when Ferrus Manus was given the Legion, and it was renamed the Iron Hands in honor of the Primarch's literal metal hands. What Manus really brought to his Legion was a need to purge weakness. The warriors of the 10th became known for using advanced machinery to turn aside enormous enemy armies, breaking overwhelming forces with technology. They also made extensive use of bionic replacements. The kind of fighting they did often left soldiers mangled. This led to a much stronger relationship with the tech priests of Mars than most legions enjoyed. This affinity for machines, coupled with the belief that the flesh is weak, led to dire consequences after the heresy began. Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus had been some of the closest friends among the Primarchs, but when Fulgrim tried to bring Manus to the Traitors, the stoic Iron Hands Primarch tried to kill him. When they finally met again on the battlefield, neither could kill the other, until Fulgrim, in his grief, gave himself to the demon in his sword and decapitated Manus. The Iron Hands shattered. Different factions followed various captains on missions of vengeance. This almost destroyed what was left of the Legion, with factions blaming the Traitors for cowardice, their allies for lack of strength, and even blaming Manus and the Iron Hands captains for indulging in emotion. Seeking to purge this weakness, the remaining Iron Hands became cold, calculating fighters who want nothing more than to purge the weakness of humanity. There has been some pushback against the doctrine recently, but the Iron Hands remain ruthlessly emotionless as a whole. Sorry, your Legion is in another castle. What's going on here? Can't be two missing legions, can there? The 12th Legion was born as the Warhounds and immediately established themselves as an effective assault force. Their discipline in training and combat was similar to legions like the Luna Wolves or the early Blood Angels, but their aggression and ferocity, once engaged, was much closer to the Space Wolves. The Emperor even kept the Warhounds in reserve for much of the Unification War in case he needed to keep other legions in line. Again, not unlike the Space Wolves, early in the Great Crusade, the prison colony on the asteroid Cerberus rose up in revolt, led by a small group of Thunder Warriors who had somehow survived the purges. With no other legion nearby, the Emperor sent the 12th. The invasion began at 0300 hours. By 0808, the all-clear was given. When asked about the state of the prisoners, the Warhounds commander replied that he had not been ordered to take any. From then on, the Legion was used as the premier assault group of the Imperium and was embedded in the 13th Expeditionary Fleet alongside elements of the Imperial Army. It was under these conditions that the 12th reunited with their Primarch Angron, who was furious about being ripped away from his gladiator family and decided to kill a bunch of his own Marines about it. Eventually, they calmed down, but the rest of this Legion's history centers on them trying, and failing, to gain the approval of their angry Gene Father. They changed their name to the World Eaters, acted more recklessly in assaults, started getting implants like Angrons that drove them insane with rage, and none of it worked. When their Primarch sided with Horus because of his unfair and frankly cruel treatment at the hands of the Emperor, the World Eaters obediently followed him straight into damnation. The mighty 13th Legion of Astartes began as the Warborn, a legion whose gene seed was noted for its high adaptability, leading them to become the home of refugees instead of drawing recruits from one cultural area of Old Terra. This became a recurring pattern, taking in recruits from defeated enemies on Earth and eventually the loyal Marines of censured or lost legions during the Heresy. Well suited to the work of a backbone force, the 13th gradually became known as a competent campaigning legion, often taking on entire war zones without support from other legions. This worked perfectly with the leadership style of their Primarch Robout Guilliman, who was adept not only at prosecuting wars, but at administration afterwards. The Legion's name was changed to the Ultramarines, and so began one of the most successful careers of any legion during the Great Crusade. Maybe it was Guilliman's excellent organizational mind, or the ease with which his legion took to diplomacy and logistics, but the Ultramarines conquered more worlds than any legion except the Luna Wolves, and their numbers swelled to eclipse any other Astartes army. Being the largest legion by far, Horus knew he had to keep the Ultramarines away from Terra, or his siege would be stopped easily. So he threw large elements of the Word-Bearers, World Eaters, Alpha Legion, and even Night Lords at the Ultramarines' home system of Macragson to keep them fighting there instead of at the Sol system. The sheer numbers of the Ultramarines are still a huge factor today, with the chapter having more successor armies than any other original legion. The Ultramarines literally wrote the book on the Astartes and love them or hate them. they are one of the most effective forces in the galaxy. A legion built on resilience, the 14th Legion, or the Dusk Raiders as they were originally called, were tough even by Astartes standards. Oddly, they began as an ambush force striking at dusk, hence the name, and making extensive use of heavier armor so they could simply walk into enemy fire for maximum intimidation. The Dusk Raiders fought like this for over 8 decades into the Great Crusade before their Primarch Mortarion was found. Himself a stoic, tough fighter, Mortarion recognized his new legion as agents of the inevitable and renamed them the Death Guard. Their way of fighting subtly shifted to attrition-style combat. Their already tough physiques lent themselves to extra protection on battlefields with harsh environmental conditions. In places that were poisonous or devoid of atmosphere, the warriors of the 14th were sent to show the enemies of humanity that the Emperor would not be turned aside by anything. This led the Legion to fight mostly as footsloggers, rarely using transports, bikes, or jump packs like other legions, instead simply advancing on foot in power armor and Terminator armor. Mortarion only really became close with Horus, so even before the Heresy, it was very likely he would fight for his brother against the Emperor. But it should be noted that not all his legionnaires felt the same, and if it wasn't for Nathaniel Garrow and the flight of the Eisenstein, the loyal forces of the Imperium would not have known about Horus's treachery until it was too late. While Mortarion originally had no intention of lowering himself to worship the powers of chaos, the Great Unclean One had other plans. Nurgle marooned Mortarion's fleet in a pocket of the warp, and the destroyer plague tore through his marines, maiming and torturing them until Mortarion pledged himself to Nurgle just to stop the pain. When the Death Guard finally arrived at Terra, the bloated forms of the new Plague Marines were terrifying and nearly unkillable. Mortarion himself ascended to daemonhood and plagues the Imperium to this day. The Thousand Sons are probably one of the most tragic stories in the Imperium. They were originally formed from recruits born inside the Emperor's lands on Terra, many of whom hadn't seen war before the Unification Wars. They were the sons of nobility, already loyal to the Emperor, and many had been educated before volunteering. The Emperor himself formed them as the Unification Wars were ending, and exactly 1,000 carefully chosen aspirants became the foundation of the 15th Legion. Aside from their beginnings, the Astartes of the Thousand Sons weren't particularly notable in how they fought or were organized until they started developing psychic powers. At first, the curious Marines of the 15th were happy about this, but it very quickly spiraled out of control. At this point in history, almost no one in the Imperium knew about the warp and the chaos powers within. That was by design. Starving the chaos gods of attention was an effective way to rob them of power. The warriors of the Thousand Sons did not know this and began to horrifically mutate. As they slowly brought the outbreaks under control, other Primarchs like Mortarion and Rogel Dorn became aware of the Psykers in the 15th and pushed to have them censured. No mutant should be allowed in the Emperor's forces. But the 15th couldn't help but learn more, and continued in secret, especially after reuniting with their Primarch Magnus, whose psychic might was second only to the Emperor's. He stabilized the mutations and reorganized the Legion into cults, a term that would eventually be used for every Astartes force. Upsettingly, it was Magnus's attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus that got his legion almost destroyed by the Space Wolves, who were ordered to deal with the Thousand Sons for breaking the rules on psychic powers, even though it was to save the Emperor. Now on the run, the 15th had no choice but to hide in the warp, which brought the mutations roaring back. Desperate cult leaders attempted a complicated spell, the rubric of Ahriman, which stopped the mutations at the cost of turning most Thousand Sons' bodies to dust. Most Thousand Sons Marines are now barely sentient automatons inside their armor, and their force travels the galaxy on mysterious missions for their god Tzeentch and to find a cure. Mirroring the rise and fall of their Primarch, Horus Lupercal, the 16th Legion started as one of the Emperor's most trusted forces. The Terran recruits came from wandering tribes known for pragmatism and independence, making the original 16th into fierce and effective shock troops. It was this quality that led the Emperor to choose them for the pacification of Luna, a battle that captured the gene labs he needed to complete the Space Marine program. As a reward, the 16th was named the Luna Wolves and given the first batches of gene seed, making them one of the strongest legions even before the Great Crusade began. That hardly changed when Horus was found on nearby Chthoniya. Horus was the very first Primarch discovered, and for 30 years he was the only one, giving him not only a strong bond with his legion, but with the Emperor and the whole Imperium. He was the Emperor's favorite son. We spoke earlier about how being the first legion gave the Dark Angels a bit of an ego. Imagine being the only legion with a Primarch for 3 decades, and that Primarch being the obvious favorite among his brothers. Needless to say, the Luna Wolves were puffed up. During the Great Crusade, the 16th pushed themselves to conquer more worlds, pursue more enemies, fight more glorious wars, and win more accolades than any other legion. Only the Ultramarines even came close. Then came Ullanor. The Ullanor Crusade was a defining moment for the Imperium, but especially for the Luna Wolves. The largest Orc empire was destroyed as the Emperor himself took the field for the final time during the Great Crusade. He then left for a mysterious project beneath Terra and proclaimed Horus Warmaster, supreme commander of all Imperial forces, second only to the Emperor himself. When he left, the Emperor suggested Horus rename his legion to reflect his new position. Though he originally refused, Horus eventually relented, and the 16th became the Sons of Horus. What happened soon after is a story for another video, but Horus was infected by the powers of chaos, thanks in part to the scheming of his brother Lorgar of the Wordbearers, and the slow slide into heresy began. After the climactic battle with the Emperor during the siege of Terra, what was left of the Sons of Horus rallied around their former first captain Abaddon and renamed themselves the Black Legion. The story of the 17th Legion is a strange one, but fitting considering they are the most direct cause of the Horus heresy. Originally named the Imperial Heralds, the 17th were made up of the sons of defeated enemies on Old Terra, raised to understand the crimes of their parents, a connection no other Space Marine was allowed to keep. This made the Marines of the 17th far more zealous in pursuit of their orders and the imperial truth, the doctrine that favored logic and reason above all else. They were the official emissaries of the Emperor, delivering ultimatums to potential enemies. A single Marine in black armor, skull helmet, and winged mace. That's right. The 17th invented Space Marine chaplains. Things took a turn when their Primarch was discovered. Lorgar Aurelian had been raised as a devout man and believed religion was a fundamental part of being human. A nice sentiment if his 2 most devoted advisors hadn't been chaos worshippers before they were made into Astartes. Once reunited with his legion, Lorgar renamed them the Word-Bearers and began twisting the imperial truth into a true religion with the Emperor at its center. Wherever they went, they built shrines to the master of mankind, until finally the Emperor had enough. He was going to sick the space wolves on them and erase them from history, like the 2nd and 11th. But the other Primarchs convinced him to show leniency, So the Ultramarines were ordered to level the word-bearers' capital city and force them to kneel in the ashes and re-pledge themselves to the imperial truth. That was all that was needed. Lorgar's advisors told him there were other gods more worthy of worship, and so the first Primarch slid into chaos worship and began planning to corrupt his greatest brother, Horus. Today, the word-bearers continue seeding cults in imperial territory and furthering the worship of the ruinous powers. The second of the most carefully and secretly created legions, the 18th, had a very specific purpose. Like the Space Wolves and the Alpha Legion, these Marines and the special changes to their gene seed were kept secret from the other legions for a long time. For the 18th, that purpose was to be the heroes of humanity. Kept in reserve for most of the unification wars, the 18th was suddenly unleashed against one of the Emperor's most dangerous enemies. 26,000 Astartes went in, only 1,000 walked out. But the enemy was defeated, and no other lives were lost. Their Primarch Vulcan saved the day in much the same manner. During a desperate fight against a large orc raiding fleet, Vulcan, who had been found but not yet reunited with his legion, suddenly arrived with 3,000 new recruits and master-forged equipment for his battered legion that had been holding the line without him. Too late to save the former commanders, Vulcan knelt to the men he had been too late to save, and the legion was his. They were renamed the Salamanders. This is why the 18th Legion was always the smallest. They would swoop into desperate situations and hold the line until their charges were safe or victory was won, always at the cost of many Astartes' lives. During the Heresy itself, the Salamanders did their best with their small numbers, but suffered several terrible defeats at the hands of the traitor legions. Vulcan himself was even captured briefly by the Night Lords, but after several executions, Conrad Cursey admitted he didn't know how to kill the apparently immortal Salamander's Primarch. The journeys of Vulcan are too complex to cover here, but just know he's still out there somewhere, waiting for his chance to return to his heroic gene sons. Until then, they continue being the Imperium's shield. In the very beginning, the 19th Legion was a guerrilla force, striking from the shadows at targets that would cause the most disruption. They operated quite similarly to the Night Lords, the intent being to sow terror and make fighting the Imperium too frightening to contemplate. However, they were often tasked with supporting the larger Luna Wolves Legion, so they never gained the same disgust from their peers. After almost a century of the Great Crusade, their Primarch was found. Corvus Corax had been leading a rebellion on the world deliverance against cruel rulers. When he saw how his legion made war, he was disgusted and purged the old leadership. He believed there were better ways to make an enemy fall than terrorizing innocents. Instead, he trained his legion to become expert trackers and assassins, using their already prodigious stealth skills to dismantle power structures. Their success led to the newly renamed Raven Guard being requested for many campaigns, including the drop site massacre at Istvan VIII. Already one of the smallest legions, the Raven Guard were ambushed as the traitor legions revealed themselves by turning their guns on their former allies. Outnumbered and fighting a straight battle they were not suited for, they were almost completely wiped out. The problems didn't stop there. Raven Guard gene seed began deteriorating faster than normal, producing horrible mutations and forcing recruitment to a crawl, a problem that persisted until the recent introduction of Primaris Marines finally solved it. The Emperor had his wolfish executioners and his draconic heroes. The last thing he needed was a legion of serpentine spies. Kept intentionally at low membership like the other two specialty legions, extremely little is known about the Alpha Legion. Originally known as the Ghost Legion, This seems to have been intentional. False records implanted while others were erased. Their special purpose was to run subterfuge operations. Imperial records only confirm their existence through vague reports of small alpha units operating far ahead of main battle lines, gathering intel, assassinating key targets, and setting up informant networks years before an Imperial fleet even arrived. From what we know, standard Alpha Legion procedure went like this. A handful of operatives, Astartes and mortal humans, arrive at the target, set up a network of crime rings, political corruption, targeted assassinations, and propaganda. Once the enemy is thrown into disarray, the main Alpha Legion forces attack from every angle in a lightning strike. The nature of the Alpha Legion is such that we can never truly be sure of anything about them. We do know their Primarch is a man named Alfarius, a name every Alpha Legionnaire gives when asked for identification. They also try to look like their Primarch, who by all accounts is one of the smallest Primarchs. Oh, and he has a twin brother. The biggest secret of the 20th Legion is that their Primarch is actually twins, Alfarius and Omegon. The two have pretended to be one another to such an extent that while Alfarius is confirmed killed after the Heresy, we're still not sure which one died, or if he actually died at all. This cloud of confusion makes it completely uncertain whether the Alpha Legion truly sided with Horus or not. They certainly fought with him against the Loyalists, and still do the work of chaos today. But there are whispers they are working from within to destabilize the ruinous powers. Overall, the Space Marine Legions are some of 40K's most discussed areas of lore. They have evolved from simple two-dimensional flavors of combat styles to full-blown characters in an epic space opera. Thank you so much for watching our very first long-form video. If you enjoyed this journey through the Legions, please show some love. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling us which Legion is your favorite, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive. With all respect, we'd be honored to have you join the channel as we explore more of the grim darkness of the far future together. We hope you'll stick with us as we bring you more lore.